All fathers this net, this is Mr. Homemaker. The situation is much worse than we feared, but there is an opportunity to fix all of it well within our grasp. The fact is that this generation of fathers is more disadvantaged than any generation of fathers that has ever preceded us, going back 10,000 years of human history. Now, obviously, I don't mean in terms of opportunities in the world. I don't mean our quality of life. To paraphrase Gary Vaynerchuk, this is the greatest time to ever be alive in the history of mankind. But in terms of the opportunity to cultivate a healthy and fulfilling, thriving marriage and family life, no set of men ever before in human history has had so many forces working against them. No one has ever been in such a deep hole in terms of marital and family dysfunction and negative outcomes for their own children. So in order for us to address that, we need to better understand what is causing that situation. What are the key factors and how did they come to be, so that we can understand what we can do. And the good news is there is a great deal we can do well within our grasp to change the trends, to turn the tide, to swing the pendulum so that our marriages, our families, our children can be better off in our time and in the next generation, rather than continuing to decline as we have for the past 75 years. My name is Marcus, also known as Mr. Homemaker. And before this, I began my adult life studying psychology and sociology in college. And then I went on for a career in the Army military intelligence, followed by a period of executive business consulting for the federal government. And so, again, I began studying psychology and sociology. I then moved into a professional military intelligence environment in the Army. And then I went on to a civilian career focusing on the federal government, also a lot of time in private sector as a business management consultant. So I have spent the last 4 years after that career trajectory. I stepped back 4 years ago to focus my time and attention exclusively on my own marriage and family life, because I could tell that we were on a path with 2 careers and 3 children that was going to take us somewhere we didn't want to go. So I have dedicated myself to understanding this history, this landscape, the set of problems, the knot of problems holding men and families back today. And while most people will not have the advantage that I had of the opportunity to step back and focus on this full time, you are going to have an advantage I didn't have, which is someone who has taken the time to consolidate and synthesize all of those lessons learned, all of the research and literature demonstrating how these patterns have formed and how we can unwind them. So that's my gift to you, is my consolidating what I've learned over the past 4 years, my master's degree in fatherhood that I earned from the School of Hard Knocks. This is my thesis to you, so that other men don't have to suffer as I suffered, or as too many men who don't have those opportunities simply watch their marriage and family life and their children go off of a cliff. So here's how we're going to do it in this video. We have 4 parts to this discussion. We're going to talk initially about the geography of family dysfunction. Much of what we actually attribute to social trends are not so much about ideas floating around in our social media or political landscape. It has much more to do with our geographic landscape and where we find ourselves as men, as families today, and how that is a departure from generations that came before us. That will lead us into a better understanding of what the dynamics are, what are the necessary ingredients, and what is the ecosystem for a healthy flourishing within a family, and why that geographic change has undermined that flourishing dynamic. But then we're going to drill into some very specific, undeniable data, right? So a lot of this is sort of abstract and theoretical, sort of conceptual, but at some point, you got to be able to point to the evidence more than just pure speculation. What does the actual data say? Okay, so we're going to talk about lessons from the last century that prove or disprove competing theories about how to have a healthy and flourishing family. And with that ramp up, with all of that knowledge then on the table, we're going to lay out a roadmap for fathers today to lead their families to a better place than they found themselves growing up in, or in the initial landscape, the initial mode of operating as a family that we sort of inherited a playbook that we'll now talk about a roadmap to move into the next era. Okay, so let's get into it. When I use the number 10,000 years, that is a specifically chosen number because although there's 200,000 years of human history, we have 10,000 years of things essentially being the same. Leading up to the Industrial Revolution in 1850, for 10,000 years, all human beings everywhere essentially had the same lifestyle. Okay, now obviously there's a range of particulars from region to region, climate to climate, tribe to tribe. But fundamentally, 10,000 years ago, humanity figured out agriculture, and we ceased being small, wandering troops of hunters and gatherers, and we became agricultural-centered people, which meant we could build communities, we could build societies, we could have stability year over year, generation after generation in a particular spot, working with the rhythms of the environment. We were able to provide food year round. We were able to store food through the winter. We were able to grow crops in the growing season. And so everywhere around the world, human beings for 10,000 years lived in little, as we see on the screen here, little hamlets, 100 or 200 people living in an agricultural environment where people generally didn't stray far from their place of birth for their entire life. Now, I'm not advocating that. I'm not saying that's we should all revert back to that way of life. I don't think that's in the cards. So just to cut off the speculation and the straw manning, I'm not saying everybody should join the Amish or something. No offense to any Amish viewers, although Weird Al would, have some choice words for why are you watching this, but I digress. Okay, now, what we have done, and we've now taken for granted because all of us were born into a very short-term experiment that began, if you want to go back to the beginning was 175 years ago, 1850, the Industrial Revolution. But then we went through, at the turn of the 20th century, and then after World War II, we went through two, double downs, right? So we put our foot further on the accelerator of this contrast between living in an agricultural environment with extended family who also never really leave, and unrelated community members who also don't really leave, right? So there's a handful of families living in a few miles of each other and have very enmeshed, interwoven lives, generation after generation. Fast forward through those rapid transitions over the past 175 years, and instead we have huge numbers of people, instead of small little hamlets and villages, we have huge numbers of people urbanizing, coming from all over the globe to these large industrial and commercial centers on top of each other where everyone around them is a stranger. What that means, let's take that down to what does that mean for marriages and family life on that second row? It means that for 10,000 years, if you were a father, you had within arm's reach, within the sound of your voice, you had a dozen or more trusted peers and mentors, from cousins, older brothers, aunts and uncles, grandparents, in-laws. You had this network of men who are similarly situated, have same foundational beliefs and values, have the same basic worldview, and are undeniably, subconsciously, and inextricably, they're invested in your well-being and the well-being of your family. So as a father and husband for 10,000 years, you couldn't help but draw upon the support of that network of men. Whereas when we have a world that we live in today of transience and individualism, which we'll get to in a different discussion, the concept of individualism as a modern innovation. But the result now is, as a husband and father, you're more likely than ever to be geographically isolated, right? You will have, in all likelihood, as soon as you've reached young adulthood, you've become 18, you will leave your hometown, either for work or for college or for trade school, or so, you will go somewhere, usually because you're pursuing employment. And if not employment directly, it's because you're pursuing education so you can pursue employment. But what that means is, as soon as you reach adulthood, you cease having a network, whatever that network might have been in your hometown, whoever you grew up with, whatever relatives you might have grown up around. You will separate yourself from them. And then you will establish a marriage and a family geographically isolated from any support. Now, the consequences, as we're going to get into, both conceptually and in terms of the data, are foreseeable, or at least they're logical. Maybe it's not fair to say that people should have seen that coming, but it's definitely something you can see in retrospect, right? Hindsight is 2020. And it's very obvious that when you have a family, a couple, and children who are surrounded by extended family and surrounded by community members with whom they have spent their entire life and with whom they plan to spend their entire life, the outcomes are much better. All other things being equal, which of course they're not, but all other things being equal, those outcomes are much better than if you take a person out of their support network, their hometown, their family and community, they marry someone else who's also taken out of their hometown, family and community, and they try to raise children and keep a marriage together while both working in isolation without any support that they don't have to pay for. And as we'll get into in the data, the outcomes for children are much worse, along with many other things. So I am connecting in your mind, I'm setting up a framework for our discussion here, that many of the ails of modern society are geographic ailments, right? We are struggling because of our geographic disconnection from our families of origin, extended family networks, lifelong friends, familiar hometown communities. That doesn't obviously tell us what the solution is, but we need to first understand the problem, and then we'll get to the solution. So, one of the things that is most clear, that is like most obvious and least deniable, is that if you are this man living in your hometown village, right? You're growing up around this support network. Then in the military, we have this concept of an OODA loop. So your ability, to paraphrase, there's a whole different video on the OODA loop, but real quickly, the idea is that your ability to function effectively and to achieve your objectives is determined by the speed and quality of your progression through an OODA loop. You have to be able to take in information in the observe phase, integrate, synthesize, analyze, extrapolate from that data knowledge, right, and wisdom. So that's your orientation, right? You take in information, now you make sense of the information and orient. The faster and better you can do that, the more quickly and the higher quality you can arrive at a decision and then put that decision into action. As you're putting decisions into action, you're taking in new information. Is this playing out the way I thought it would? What am I learning from my attempt to put this decision into action? How should I change my model, my projections, and my synthesis? So every time you do that loop, every time you complete a OODA loop, you should be incrementally getting better. But the speed and quality of your OODA loop is largely affected by the degree to which you can draw upon others' knowledge and wisdom, right? Because if you are trying to figure out, as if you are on an island, which you might not literally be on an island, but you're isolated. You're on an island of marriage and an island of your nuclear family, totally separated from trusted, long-term, people with whom you have an enduring bond. And so you're on an island and you're trying to, as if you're the first man ever to figure it out, as if you're the first man ever trying to figure out, how should this marriage thing go? What's it like to be a good dad? How should I do it? And you are having to figure that out on your own, based on your own, only your first person experience, your direct observations. So you have very little information to draw upon. You have very little bandwidth and a very unsophisticated model to use for orientation. So your decisions are very low quality. It's very difficult to arrive at them. It's very difficult to have confidence in them. You're very slow and you're very low quality. So your ability to apply an OODA loop effectively to your marriage and family life, your role as a man, a husband, a father, is dramatically diminished by the lack of network that you should have, that for 10,000 years every man before you had. Okay, so that I wanted to hit that one home particularly hard. But now, again, let's think about why does this is it so deleterious? Why is this such a negative? It's toxic, right? It's corrosive. Why is this geographic change, this lack of a network, so corrosive to flourishing as a family? And you can interpret this both as a nuclear family or as the human family, as a society, or anything in between, right? If your broad family network, your extended family, is geographically dispersed across the continent or the country or the world, your flourishing is going to correspondingly deteriorate. And here's why. Let's talk about why. In order, one of the things that all humans need is a sense of shared belonging, right? As we see in the bottom left-hand corner of this triangle. If you think you don't need that, then you have a broken model of human nature, right? If you have an accurate understanding of what it is to be a human animal, a human being, then you know that we are social creatures and that we need to have a sense of belonging, a sense of shared belonging, a sense of shared destiny, a sense of mutual interdependence with others. Okay, there's a whole other video about that concept, that long-term classic pillar of understanding human nature, and how we've recently gotten away from that. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's take for granted that we already acknowledge and accept that we need to have a sense of shared belonging in order to be a flourishing human being. The ability to maintain a sense of shared belonging among people requires certain inputs. That's what the arrows are indicating. What are the inputs and what are the outputs? So in order for shared belonging to exist, from the members coming from the right, coming from the members of that community, each individual must offer to the group and to the other members of the group. They must offer them loyalty and duty, right? They have a sense of loyalty. They respect the group, and they will do what is in the interest of the group. That's what loyalty is. And duty is a recognition of, there are certain things I might not want to do, but I owe the other individuals, or I owe the group certain duties. I must do certain things. I have an obligation just by intrinsically as being a member of this group. I owe the group duties. So in order for there to be shared belonging, each member of the group must observe that, because otherwise, if each member of the group isn't offering the group loyalty and duties, then the individuals who are members of that group are unable to benefit through the rights and privileges that the group confers, right? The group dissolves because the group it draws from the loyalty and duty of its members, and then it pays out in this economy of human flourishing, this ecology. It pays out rights and privileges. So if you cut off the inputs, you can't. If you're not putting in any deposits, you can't make any withdrawals. Okay. Now, in order for that group to work, right, in order for groups to function and maintain their coherence, it requires another input from above, is order, right? Someone has to maintain order. Someone or some set of people have to establish order in order for a group to exist and thrive. So the group in return honors the people who provide order, right? So just the typical classic thing that people have so far generally maintained, continued to accept, is that a teacher in a school or a classroom, she maintains order, or he maintains order, though 80% of the time it's a woman. It's another video. She maintains order, and the children are expected to honor and respect her as a teacher. We would recognize that something will break if all the members of that group, all the children in that group, refuse to pay respect and honor to the teacher. That will make it impossible for her to maintain order. And without order, there will be no group cohesion. There will be no shared sense of belonging in that classroom. So all of these things are necessary in order for human flourishing to continue. All legs of this must exist, and each exchange in the economy or the ecology must continue. But I would suggest to you that right away we can see how over the past 75 years, not necessarily all 175, everything you can trace back a little further to like when was the seed first planted. And yes, I think 175 years ago is when a lot of seeds were planted. And 75 years ago, right about 1950, is when things really started to take off, right? Things started to take bloom in very negative ways, right? So it's very easy to see that by just considering where we are now. Where we are now is we still have a great deal of emphasis placed in our society on rights and privileges, right? There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of clamor, a lot of sign waving and fist pumping for rights and privileges. There's a lot less emphasis placed on people being loyal and fulfilling their duties, right? And there's even like sort of an allergy to the idea of maintaining order, right? I think that there's an anarchistic impulse that has taken root. And certainly it flows from, maybe this is the motivating factor, is there is a true disgust with the idea that some people deserve honor. They should be honored above and beyond to a different degree or quality than everyone deserving honor, right? So if you have an egalitarian mindset where you reject honor and you reject order being imposed, well, then that means it's impossible to maintain group cohesion, which means you cannot have shared belonging, which was already being eroded by the unwillingness of people to be loyal and to perform duties to members of their family, members of their community, their extended family, etc. Right? Now, the other thing that we haven't addressed, but it's worth just noting here, is that there's also a relationship with these two legs to the third, which is at the individual level, individuals need to be competent and they need to have responsibility for themselves. They need to be capable of responsibility for themselves. That makes them valuable members of the group, right? They're able to perform their duties because they're competent and they're responsible. If they're not competent and responsible, then they're unable to perform the duties, even if they would like to. And so then you ask, well, where does competence and responsibility come from? Well, it is developed through being held accountable. It's developed through having to confront the consequences of one's own choices, to developing judgment, to being able to exercise judgment independently, and to progressively improve in your exercise of judgment through being held accountable and being obedient to whatever authority figure, whatever person has taken ownership of your formation. So again, I think, as I say, you will recognize that many of the things I just said as truths about human flourishing, many of those things are treated with hostility in our society today. And the consequence is clear. Now, how does this connect back to the geography element? The geography element is when you have people who grow up in a community of lifelong interdependence, then they have a very strong sense of belonging because they know that it is worthwhile. It is obvious to me that investing in you, either at that ownership level, holding you accountable, is worth it because you are a member of my community, my family, and I need to hold you accountable because I recognize it's very immediate. It's literally visible within my little village that your behavior affects all of us. And so we are all in agreement that we need to maintain order. We need to hold people accountable because we're all in this little world together. We all live in this little ecosystem together. That is not possible in the anonymous world of urban living, where everyone is transient and everyone is a stranger. Right? It is much more difficult to establish a long-term reciprocal interdependence and interest in one another's flourishing. And so without that, there's no shared identity, right? I mean, other than maybe cheering for the same sports team. But there's very little behavior, very little like competence and individual responsibility that's cultivated through cheering for the same sports team. Very different from we all live in this village and we cultivate the same crops together, the same field. And so I'm very interested in developing your competence and your responsibility for yourself, your reliability. I'm very interested in making sure that you're performing your duties, and I'm very interested in making sure that everyone, including you, is benefiting from the rights and privileges that they deserve. But there's no plausible way to establish and sustain that kind of dynamic in the geographic isolation and the the population density of strangers that is established in the modern urban and suburban living that we invented 75 years ago, after 10,000 years of this engine of human flourishing being so effective. All right, so that discussion that that little touch point, that topic of human flourishing, what it requires, that's one way to look at it, is that three-legged stool of ownership, individual responsibility and competence, and then shared belonging, right? So that three-legged stool, that ecosystem, is one way to understand what is necessarily involved in human flourishing. And you'll see that there in the training progression as the top level of the mental fitness pillar, right? Fit for fatherhood refers to the 4 pillars of fatherhood, of 4 pillars of fitness: physical fitness, mental fitness, adaptive fitness, and emotional fitness. So far our discussion has really been around this, and this whole video really focuses on understanding human flourishing. And so we're taking for granted some of the underlying concepts that over the course of the training progression would be covered in detail that build up to this discussion of human flourishing. So we're skipping over some of the groundwork for the purposes of this video and just focusing on that top level of mental fitness, because in order to fulfill your roles and responsibilities as a father, you need to be mentally fit in the sense that you need to have accurate models of how to cultivate a healthy marriage and family life and community and fulfill your roles and responsibilities. That's a matter of knowledge and wisdom. And so, yes, experience comes into play, but as we said with the OODA loop, it is foolishness to think that you ought to approach this as if you're the first or only man in the world, rather than drawing upon 10,000 years of human civilization, or drawing upon a network of men who are competent and qualified to offer you support and guidance and mentorship and accountability in forming and refining your model in that OODA loop process. So just by way of sort of grounding and contextualizing this conversation, this is where it resides in the Fit for Fatherhood training progression. Okay, so how did all this come to be, right? So I'm painting an ugly picture of why marriages are falling apart and child outcomes are deteriorating. And I've alluded to this 175-year timeline and this 75-year timeline. We're not going to be able to cover like every sort of domino that fell and every unfolding dynamic. But in this video, I do want to cover some of the biggest, the most essential lessons from the last century, right? So here in 2025, to date the video, when I say 75 years, I mean 1950. So we look at this chart as a starting point. We say, if in the 1950s you were starting a family, you were actually the youngest that anyone had been as a husband and wife in many generations, right? We had this sort of cliche that we like throw back to, like, oh, everybody was getting married at 13. Like, there may be some time or place where that was like sort of the norm, but honestly pretty ridiculous. The reality is that for all relevant intents and purposes, the baseline ages are 26 years old for a man and 26 and 22 for a man and a woman to get married, right? So a man is on average 4 years older than his wife. He's just entering his late 20s, and she is in her early 20s. That is our baseline at the turn of the century, in the 1900s. Okay. Now, then we went through. We're not going to go point by point, but just put in the back of your mind. Then there's World War I, a Great Depression, and World War II breaks out. Now, the other thing you might not have thought about during that time period is we're at the peak of industrialization. We're at the peak of the urban migration from those villages and hamlets, that agricultural lifestyle, into cities. They're just being built for the first time. So it wasn't like going to the city was like we think of it now, like, oh, it's like this luxurious, glamorous place. No, it was just like this, tenement housing and shacks and people like trying to be as close as they can to wherever some factory was or some port or some mine. And so that urban rush is not what you think of as urban life today. And this was before there were any labor laws, essentially. And so we're not talking 40-hour work weeks. We're talking, instead of 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, we're talking 10 to 12 hours a day. And we're talking 6 days a week. And furthermore, you have to consider what a drastic and dramatic break that was with all of history up to that point. Because for those 10,000 years, when men went to work on the farm in their village, work was just go outside. It's right there. I can see you in the field, in the orchard. I see you with the sheep on the hill. I can holler to you that it's lunchtime. I can ring a bell. If something goes wrong, I'll send one of the kids out to go get you. Right. So this idea of this like norm we've established of like, oh, well, dad just like goes off to work. For 10,000 years, dad didn't go off to work. For 10,000 years, dad worked just here at home. And then really at the turn of the century, the 1900s, we, for the first time, said, we're going to take dad out of the home, whatever. Let me do some quick math. 12 times 6, right? 72 hours a week plus commuting. So like 100 hours a week. And so he'll go home and sleep, and that's about it. Now, that means that if you got married in 1950, right, if you are instead of getting married at 26, because we're coming back from the war, among other things, and there's a whole bunch of government subsidies for new families, and particularly GIs. And so guys come back from the war, that guy who's, let's say he's 24 years old in 1950, so that means he was born in 26. That kid grew up without a dad, right? And instead of growing up in a village surrounded with his father every day and surrounded by aunts and uncles and brothers and cousins and grandparents, they had moved to some big city where they didn't know anybody. His father was never around. And so he never even had a male role model, and never got to observe, the way generations had before him, a healthy husband-wife dynamic throughout the day. He was just deprived of that experience because of urbanization, industrialization. So when he gets married, oh, and by the way, then he gets shipped off to war. So instead of spending his late adolescence, early, young adulthood, apprenticing or learning a trade or like generally like finding himself in society as a young adult, he was busy, fighting the Germans. No offense to the Germans, to the Nazis, right? Or he was in the Pacific fighting the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. So that is not normal civilian domestic life. And so when he comes back, he neither had role models nor did he have time to find himself. And quickly he settles down with some girl who has also had a estranged relationship with her father, probably worked rather than experienced any domestic life. And so the two of them then once again hop to some new place, because in the 1950s we invented the suburbs. And so some of these guys come back, get the GI Bill, go to college. Some of them go straight into working. But they grew up in isolation. Now they're going to further isolate themselves. They had never had a positive role model. They're the youngest husband and wife in many generations. And so they're by far the least capable parents that up to that point any human family had, any two people had ever created. And so unsurprisingly, when you're a baby boomer, right, you were born in the 50s, essentially, let's say, you had the most dysfunctional household that had ever existed up to that point. So a baby boomer born in the 1950s, their parents were the youngest and the least qualified and had the least support because we invented this concept of not just nuclear family isolation, but then individual isolation. And then we're going to literally, the big win is instead of being in a city full of strangers, now you can be in a suburb full of strangers, and you can keep all those strangers at bay inside your by putting up a white picket fence. Now, there's so many things we could say about what that does to people psychologically, what that did to women of the greatest generation, and how that influenced children of the baby boomer generation. But it's just so important that we understand how much of what went on in that period, in the 1950s, was such a dramatic break from the past, which we had already broken from, right? We had 10,000 years of steady civilization, essentially a steady way of life for people around the globe. And then we rapidly and dramatically changed it in ways that directly affected the well-being of husbands and wives and children. Okay. Okay, so the global average, which used to, the U.S. has departed over the course of this narrative I just provided, has significantly departed from the global norm. If we break down, we're taking a fourth grade class. If you got a fourth grade class of 20 kids, globally, you look at the arrangement of those kids. Are they going home to a family, a homestead, or a house with an extended family situation, or are they going home to a 2-parent household with no extended family? Or are they going home to a single family household, right? So the global average is that out of 20 kids, 8 of them, almost half, are in an extended family situation. And the next 10, so literally half of them, live in a household with 2 parents. Now, I would submit to you, it's not in the data, but I would submit to you that even if they're living in a 2-parent household, that 2-parent household is geographically closer to extended family and long-term, like, my dad and my neighbor went to school together kind of thing. Or like my uncle lives down the block from us, right? So that's not in the data, but it's a fair inference. So that what you're really looking at is almost all of them have some kind of like extended family enduring network. And 2 out of the 20 global average are going home to a single parent home, which again doesn't necessarily mean they aren't geographically close to family. Because most of the world didn't go through the urbanization and suburbanization, the urban sprawl that the United States did. It's a peculiar U.S. phenomenon. And so you look at the bottom, and we're a flip, basically. And so only 2 out of the 20 kids in a 4th grade classroom in the U.S., only 2 of those kids go home to an extended family situation, rather than the 8. That's the global average. Now, there are 13 who are in a 2-parent home, but this really means 2 adults. It doesn't necessarily mean your mom and dad, and it doesn't mean that they're married, because as we'll get to in a subsequent set of data, there's a lot more turbulence in a household for an average child who's in 4th grade. At the time of or leading up to them being in 4th grade, being 9 years old, the likelihood that they have had some kind of turbulence in their home life is much greater in the United States than anywhere else. And so there's 13 in that category, and then there's 5 who are going home to a single family household. And again, think about much more often than not, and by far and away more often than it had ever been. Even in that single parent situation, that single parent may very well be geographically isolated from any extended family support network. Okay. Now, we were thinking earlier in the previous slide about a family that's starting in 1950, right? Members of its greatest generation getting married and having kids in 1950 or that decade. Well, not only did marriage, the average age of marriage start climbing again, it surpassed its prior norm, right? It didn't just return to the average. It pendulum swung so that people are like 30 now getting married instead of mid-20s or early 20s. Now we're at 30s. But in addition to that, marriage rates went down. I didn't put that slide in this deck, but we all know that marriage rates have gone down. We know that divorce rates have gone up. The other thing that people don't necessarily take into account is that when those baby boomers got to be of age, when they reached young adulthood, they were born, remember, they were born between 50 and 60. So that means, add 20 years, let's say 75. Well, look at the chart here. As they came of age, starting right around 70, really like late 60s, but like starting right around 70 and 75, we reached a fever pitch with the rate at which children were being born to unwed mothers. Now we got to think a little bit precisely here. What do we mean by being born to unwed mothers? Now, it could be, you can think of many different scenarios. One scenario, two people conceive a child. They realize that the woman is pregnant and they get married. They have some lead time before the child is born. So like you could get married now that you're pregnant. So this isn't number of conceptions that occurred outside of marriage. This is number of births. So think about another scenario. You are married, your wife gets pregnant, and then now that she's pregnant, you race to divorce her. Okay, so that seems much, much less likely, right? It's just common sense. It's obvious that there's a much stronger push to get married, right? An expectation, an impulse, a pressure, an incentive to rush to get married when you realize that a woman is pregnant. Then there is a rush to get divorced when you realize that she's pregnant, right? So that's a one-sided thing. That's not 50-50. But despite that, you have this time, just more and more often, women were getting pregnant and giving birth to the child. So we're not counting contraception. We're not counting abortions. This is live births of children too. When that child is born, they have a mom. And the question is mom married to anybody? And we went from a world back in 1940 where about like somewhere under 5%, less than 5%, less than 1 in 20 in that fourth grade class, less than 1 in 20 children would have been born to a mother who was not married. Now we fast forward and the baby boomers made it cool to have a baby without being married. And they continued to make it cool. They taught those children that it's cool, Gen Xers, which is why you fast forward another 20 years and you get into the 90s, and you have now on the national average is that we have more than 1/3, right? So 7 or 8 kids in a classroom of fourth graders, 7 or 8 of them when they were born, their mom didn't have a husband. Now, at some point later, she might have gotten one. That's a different situation. And she might be cohabitating with somebody, but she's not married to him. And he may or may not be the father. So that is the case now. Instead of 1 out of 20 kids, it's 7 or 8 out of 20 kids were brought up in that situation. Now a lot of this is a lot of data without a lot of like, well, so what? Okay. You could say none of this really matters. This is just like academic, and all of this, doesn't mean anything, right? As long as we're flourishing as families and as communities and as individuals, we're flourishing. It doesn't really matter. Marriage is just a piece of paper kind of stuff. You can say that. So let's look at what happens, right? What are the consequences of this situation? As we've said, you take a 1960 classroom. That means that all the moms and dads are the greatest generation, and we've got a classroom full of baby boomers. We're taking that baby boomer when they're 9 years old. So they were born in 1951. In 1960, they're in fourth grade. Now, we're going to compare and contrast that classroom of baby boomers to a classroom today these are children of millennials today in a fourth grade classroom. And so we want to ask ourselves, okay, how many kids in this classroom, from the time they were born to the time they're in fourth grade, their parents have been married? They've always been married. They're living in a stable marital household. And then the second one is, well, how many of these kids at some point, maybe now, maybe the whole time, or maybe just at some point, mom was unmarried. Maybe she was unmarried when the child was born, but then she later got married to the dad or to anybody. Maybe she was married when the child was born, but then she got divorced. Now she's still divorced, or she's remarried, right? But at some point, it was just mom. How many kids are in that situation? And then the final situation is, well, how many kids in this fourth grade class are living with two people who aren't married, may or may not be mom and dad, but it's probably mom and there's another man who's probably dad, but not necessarily. And they've been together for as long as the kid's been alive, right? How long do kids are in that situation? Okay, now let's do a compare and contrast 1960s to 2020. In 1960s, 18 out of the 20 kids, 90%, in a 1960s classroom, all those baby boomers, 18 of them, when they were born in 1951, mom was married to dad. And mom has always been married to dad. She's still married to dad. Here I am in fourth grade. I come from a household of two married people. They've always been married. They're not planning to not be married, right? And two of the kids would have at some point had a single mom situation. So that could be for any reason. At some point up to and including fourth grade, it's just mom, there's no dad. Those are the only two scenarios. But 18% or 18 out of 20 married, always been married. Contrast that with 2020. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but there's another video about this in particular. But one thing is we changed the law in the 1960s, and we made it okay to just divorce somebody with no reason whatsoever. At 1960, up to this point, you could have gotten a divorce, but you had to convince a judge that you were justified in getting a divorce. You essentially had to point to like some malfeasance, some poor behavior, some violation of your rights and privileges as a spouse by the other. And so like they're not taking care of you. They're being disloyal. They're abusive, whatever it might be, right? They're unreliable. They're incompetent. They're not responsible. All those things we talked about in human flourishing. If you could demonstrate to a judge in one way or another that there was a failure to cultivate a healthy and flourishing marriage and family life, then you could get a divorce. In 1960, we changed the rules and we said, actually, you don't need any reason. Just if you don't want to be married anymore, you don't have to be married anymore. And so, flash forward, now instead of 18 out of 20 people have always been in a married household, we now have 10 out of every 20. Half of the class has always, their mom and dad have been married since they were born and they're still married as of fourth grade. But then there's 8 kids instead of 2. There's 8 kids now, almost the other half, who at some point have just been living with their mom. Maybe they've always just been living with their mom. Maybe mom was at some point cohabitating, but then they broke up, which happens in 50% of cohabitation up to this age, right? So up to fourth grade, not talking about forever, but saying in the life of a child, the stats are that there's a 50% chance if your parents are cohabitating that they will split before you're in fourth grade, before you're 9 years old. Whereas in the case of marriage, there's only a 20% chance, the less than half a probability that your married parents will split before you reach fourth grade. But in a 2020 classroom, almost half, 8 out of the 20 kids will have at some point, maybe at that point, be living with just their mom, no dad. And then the other 2 are in the situation of, well, I live with my mom and a man who may or may not be my dad, but they're not married. That's 2 out of the 20 kids. Okay, so what this shows, again, is I'm saying one major change, geography. Second major change, the greatest generation, the parents of the baby boomers, the ones who were the moms and the dads in 1960, were the least qualified and the least supported husbands and wives, mothers and fathers humanity had ever seen before, around the world or throughout time. They were the least supported, they were the least on-the-job training, the least mentorship, the least support. They were the most estranged from their parents, as well as their extended family and community, and most especially from their fathers. Okay. They grew up and they normalized being divorced, cohabitating, raising a child without a father. Now, you could still say, okay, I see the dominoes. I see how these things are connected. I see the chain of events. But so what? Maybe that's okay. Maybe all of this is fine. Maybe none of this matters and it's purely academic. Okay, let's ask. Are we better off? Are we all happier now that, ever since the 1950s and 60s, we have said, hey, women can get divorced for any reason they want. We're going to set up a society where children can be raised by just women. They're not dependent on a man. So we're going to hypothesize that, well, we can ensure better outcomes for people by having fewer constraints on them, less accountability. They have to be less obedient to an authority figure, like the rules. There are fewer rules that they have to obey. We're going to give them a lot more slack in how they organize their lives and live their lives. Okay, so did that make them happier? Now, as of 1970, men and women reported happiness, right? In this longitudinal survey that they're saying, in general, how satisfied would you say you personally are with your life, right? These are adults, not children, but we're looking at both men and women. Back in 1970, so this is the greatest generation is becoming empty nesters, and baby boomers are young adults, right? They're coming of age. Back then, men and women pretty happy. Then that is the time that we made a bunch of policy changes. We made no-fault divorce great. We made it legal to get divorced for any reason. We changed a bunch of labor laws. We legalized abortion and contraception. And as we saw in the other charts, fewer marriages, more divorces, and more children being born to unwed mothers. Okay, so that's the setup in 1970. We've begun the experiment in full swing, right? We got the idea in our head in the 1950s because our moms and dads were so dysfunctional. We had dysfunctional households. And so then we said, we don't want to live like this. So we're going to change all these rules come 20 years from now. So it's 1970. We change all the rules. We start the experiment. Everybody's pretty happy. And then we see that every decade people get less happy. It used to be women were a little happier than men, but then both men and women got less happy over the next 10 years. And then 10 more years went by and they were even less happy. And then by the time we get into the 1990s, people are not just less happy, they're actually unhappy. Both men and women are actually unhappy. And even more than that, women got less happy. They got more unhappy faster than men did. So they had this advantage. Women tended to be happier in the 70s and presumably before, but we can't say that with the data we have. But in the 70s, women were a little happier than men. Everybody was pretty happy. Once we break into the mid 90s, nobody's happy. And women have lost a lot more happiness than men have. So when we're asking the question, why does any of the data matter? What do any of these changes mean? What it means is it makes everybody unhappy. Men and women are worse off today after implementation of these policies. They've gotten progressively less happy the farther down the road of implementing these policy changes and lifestyle changes. Okay, now, but then you could say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for the kids. That's true. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But the good news is we have data on that too. We have data on childhood outcomes. Children today are 5 times more likely, forgive me, 4 times more likely. We went from 1 out of the 20 kids in 1960 in the 4th grade classroom, 1 out of 20 would have been obese. Now we've quadrupled that up to 20%. So 4 kids now instead of 1, there's now 4 kids who are obese. And that's not randomly a dart hitting 4 kids instead of 1. It means everybody's gotten less healthy. It's just that instead of just 1, you have a bell curve or a logarithmic curve or whatever, So you have a curve, and instead of 1 kid being way out on the edge, it's no, we've shifted the whole curve. And now 1 out of every 5 kids, 4 kids in that 20 kid classroom are obese. which means a whole bunch more are unhealthy and overweight. They don't qualify as obese. And so only a minority, maybe a third, let's say, are a healthy weight. Whereas it would have been the majority in the middle of that bell curve a few generations earlier. Okay, so now there's a lot of things you could attribute that to. We're going to get to a couple of ways you can connect the dots, and in other videos we can connect them other ways because there's numerous permutations. There's so many charts, so many studies, so much data I've poured over. I'm not giving you the like exhaustive tour today. I'm just trying to give you like some of the highlights, connect some of the big dots, and see the pattern, right? But it's not just physical health, because it's not just a matter of like, oh, we became more sedentary. Also, mental health of children has continued to decline at an accelerating rate. And so, going back to even between 2010 and 2020, let's say, we did have 5% of boys. So again, one kid in it. Well, actually, so yeah. So let's take the average, right? Because we have a co-ed classroom of 20 kids. So let's just say it's 10%. We used to have 10% having major depression. So that means 2 kids, maybe, probably less, had major depression, of like a boy and a girl. Although there might be 2 girls, because girls have higher rates of depression than boys do. So back in 1960, we're just saying 2010, but you'd have 2 kids out of the 20. But now we've like doubled up. And so we now have 30% of girls and 10% of boys. We're averaging 20% instead of 10 of people with major depression in 4th grade. So if that trend continues, which is sharply climbing, not leveling off yet, either it's going to add another 5 and 20%. It's going to either double, or it's going to double again. So we're either going to have just under or just over 10 out of 20 kids. 50% of the classroom is going to have major depression in the next 10 years. Okay. Now, there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of different ways to connect the dots. Many studies connect different dots different ways, attribute different levels of causality to different factors. But there's some things we can say with great degree of confidence, a high level of certainty. There are many things that we can say about causal relationships and what we can learn from that. So here's what we can say with a high degree of certainty, right? High confidence. We can quibble about the details and the exceptions to the rules, but the data is in. We've been running an experiment for the past 75 years. Ever since the greatest generation came back from war, settled down in the suburbs, they raised the baby boomers, we started an experiment. And the control is not 1950. That was the experiment. This is where everybody gets messed up. Everybody thinks 1950 is like the baseline. It's not the baseline. We'd already begun the experiment. The baseline is 10,000 years of agrarian small town living. Then we had the industrial experiment, and then we had the information age experiment, the suburbia experiment. Now, the data is in. We have the data. And here are some things we can say with high degree of confidence. The first thing we can say is that children do better. Their outcomes are better. They're healthier, happier. Their mental health is better when mom and dad are married. A child of mom and dad being married has a better, more fulfilling, happier life than a child whose parents are not, all other things being equal. The other thing is women, not all women, mothers. We only care about mothers. We're excluding women who have no children. But if you just look at mothers who are married report higher levels of happiness, right? Women who are married are happier with their lives than mothers who are unmarried. Forgive me if I said women, I meant mothers. So married mothers happier than unmarried mothers. So children are better off if their parents are married. They're also better off. There's a direct correlation, a causal link between a happy mom and a child's positive outcomes. So marriage benefits the child directly, the stability of the marriage. Marriage benefits the woman directly. She's happier. Mom's happier when she's married. And her happiness also benefits the children. So the child gets a twofer. If mom is married, mom's happier. Being in a married household and a happier mom, that's 2 points in favor for the child, right? The next thing we know, the data shows that the more time and attention that the father gives to the children, the better the child's outcomes are. The better their cognitive development, the better their social development, the fewer obstacles and challenges and difficulties they'll experience in adolescence, and the higher their mental health, the higher their academic outcomes. Not that I care about academic outcomes per se, but it's an indicator of their ability to function well, right, through childhood and adolescence. The more time and attention that their father is able to give to them, the better their outcomes. Now, we didn't talk about this yet in this video. It is another study for another video. But the other thing is that checklist there, and that represents accountability. Children do better when their mother is happier, and they do better when they are held accountable by their father. Part of the time and attention, not all the time and attention, part of the time and attention that the father is giving to the children is holding them accountable, because as we went back to our triangle of flourishing, being held accountable and having to obey is the mechanism by which the individual develops competence and responsibility for themselves. And so the more time and attention the father is able to give to the children, the stronger their relationship, yes, but also the more competence and responsibility they develop through the accountability that the father is providing. Okay, so we know all that. That's a bunch of information about what benefits children with regard to their mother and father, the relationship between them, and how they interact with the child. The next set of things we know in the bottom left-hand corner there is spending more time in institutional care, like school or formal extracurriculars, spending more time in a classroom setting with rigid structures and, regimented routines, and spending time with technology, most especially social media. But the more time a child spends on modern technology, on the internet, essentially, all those things are bad for a child's outcome, right? So too much school, too much extracurriculars, and too much social media reduces childhood outcomes. Everything gets worse. Health, mental health, happiness, driven down by those features. What drives up childhood outcomes in terms of their lifestyle, their day-to-day, is the more responsibility they have, right? The more autonomy they have, the more they have the opportunity to exercise their own agency, which is what that little piggy bank represents, right? If they have some kind of chores or some kind of job in their adolescent years, that directly leads to higher confidence, esteem, and as we said, responsibility for yourself, competence that you develop by being responsible in an unstructured way, right? Like you're out in the wild, you're having to run a lemonade stand or deliver papers, not I'm in a classroom, right? Being held accountable for doing your homework is not the same thing as getting to do something entrepreneurial or in an apprenticeship intern kind of sense. But beyond that, children's mental health, well-being, and outcomes as they enter adulthood are increased by the more time they spend in unstructured environments with their peers, unsupervised time, right? So instead of dropping the kid off at an extracurricular at the school or at the youth center for an hour and a half, if you take your kid to the playground for an hour and a half and they run free with the other kids, if the latter is your default, your child will be better off long term. Their mental health will improve. Now, obviously, there's a constraint there because in most places it's not legal, or at least it's not socially acceptable to just like drop your 12-year-old off at the playground and like leave, for better or worse, pros and cons. But we know that If you read your book in the car while they're playing on the playground and you're not hovering over them, they turn out better if they have more time like that, unstructured time with their peers, than if you try to substitute supervise structured extracurricular times. Right? It does not deliver positive outcomes. Okay. Now, there's a bunch of sort of inferences and assertions that I've sprinkled throughout this presentation. As I said, this is not exhaustive and it's not airtight, but it's also not unreasonable, right? I would defy anyone to suggest that anything I said here is totally baseless. That you could say like, well, I'm not convinced. Like there's like a lot of like things I can imagine that would undermine the connections you're drawing, and that's fair. I think that would be reasonable. And if that's the case, in other videos, I will go into more detail about like why we can eliminate different factors and why we can be confident about causal relationships. That's a reasonable conversation to have. Just for the interest of time, I didn't, in this video, try to be as exhaustive as possible. But if you're really saying that you just reject all of this data, you just reject all of this reasoning, all these inferences, you're like, no, none of this is real. And until it's airtight, I'm just not interested. I'm not interested in hearing any of this, right? Well, then I would submit to you that you're exhibiting a toxic mindset that prevents you from like navigating the world effectively. Which, going back to our framework, we're talking up here at a high level about human flourishing, but in order to like get to that level, we've got to have a shared foundation there at the ground level of mental fitness, of practical and systematic philosophy. And I don't mean philosophy in sort of like a pie in the sky, like super aloof academic way, but just like you have to have some reasonable framework for how you think about what you know and how you know it, and like what you think is credible, and like what authorities or experts or data you're like willing to accept and under what circumstances. Many people today have developed and embraced a sort of one-sided skepticism where they set a very high threshold for the evidence that they demand people provide to make a case they don't want to hear. And they set little or no barriers to people and arguments that they intuitively agree with. They accept those with no evidence. And so I'm not trying here to provide evidence that will overcome that kind of irrational, one-sided ideological barrier. That's outside the scope of my business. I'm trying rather to provide information to people who are receptive and primed to understand, yes, it is obvious that marriages, families, and child outcomes are getting worse, and I'm interested in knowing what's causing it. I'm interested in knowing what things under my control can I toggle or adjust in order to improve the outcomes for my children. And as we're going to get to here in the next section, what are the big moves I can make so that my family today and the next generation to come after me, my children's marriages and my grandchildren's childhoods can be better? How can we learn from this 75-year experiment? And that's where we'll end this video. But we've got to recognize, in order to have a worthwhile and productive conversation, we've got to be working on some compatible level of how we philosophically think about what can we know and how do we know it, and how much should we rely on our intuition versus experts versus tradition versus data, right? So like there's a range of answers within that, but then there's a lot of wrong answers on the extremes that prevent people from taking the data seriously. They are ideologically blinded to what is right in front of us. We have the data that shows that the policies and lifestyles that we put in place 75 years ago have led to negative outcomes. The data is in. The experiment has completed. Now it's just a question of what we're going to do about it, whether or not we're going to accept that data. Okay, so one more time, here's the thing. Get married, spend a lot more time, give a lot more attention to your children. Make sure your wife is happy. Get your kids out of structured extracurriculars. Get them more chores and maybe a paper route, and tell them to go outside and play with the kids without adult supervision. If you can do those things, to the extent you can do any or all of them, the more that you do, the better your child's or children's outcomes will be. It's a fact. It's the data. Okay. So for the purposes of avoiding the dead ends and pitfalls of trying to interact with people who have either a barrier that prevents them from thinking and communicating clearly about this stuff, or have an ideological motive to refuse to do so, right? In order to resolve that problem, Fit for Fatherhood requires an affirmation of a creed in order to apply for membership, right? Because I have learned through the School of Hard Knocks, through failed attempts to have productive dialogues with people who hold fundamentally broken worldviews and philosophical premises, ideological commitments that keep them from having a rational discussion. I have learned that in order to have a community of people working together, sharing information and upgrading one another's models so that they can move through that OODA loop more quickly and more effectively, all of that must be predicated on a foundational mutual understanding of basic beliefs and values about human nature and basic alignment, or at least compatibility with what is our understanding of our roles and responsibilities, our vision for cultivating a healthy marriage and family life as men, right? So the creed, details, encapsulates, draws some lines around what is in and what is out of bounds for what your philosophical sort of starting point is. It's not you must agree with a specific set of claims. It's just you have to be within the contours of what is productive, and you cannot adhere to or like promulgate some ideology that is toxic to human flourishing, right? And so in another video, or you can check it out yourself at mr-homemaker.com. That's where you're seeing this creed. It's here. You go to the homepage, mr-homemaker.com, and then you go to the mission page and you scroll down to the creed. Here you go. So you can read that there yourself, and that is how the creed came to be, is in order to create a gated community of people who at least have valid and compatible worldviews that will allow them to follow where the reasoning as well as data take us for how to reverse the negative trends that our marriages and families and children are experiencing. Okay, so let's end off with what are the exact steps, right? What is the roadmap? Here's your step-by-step how you right now can start down the path of improving outcomes for your children, as well as for yourself and for your wife and for generations to come, right? You can, number one, the most important thing you can do is strengthen your marriage. If you're not married, get married. If you are married, make it your top priority to cultivate a healthy dynamic between you and your wife, right? You need to work on, as you probably saw on the curriculum, there's communication and conflict resolution, for example, under emotional fitness, right? But you need to pursue strengthening your marriage, strengthening the bond, strengthening your ability to communicate and cooperate with one another, right? Number one priority, the single biggest thing you can do. So it happens logically first, and it's the biggest bang for your buck. Invest in your marriage if you want better outcomes for your children. All right, the next thing you can do is figure out how you and your wife can convert time and attention that you're currently dedicating to work. Convert time and attention from work into time and attention that you're giving your children. Also reduce your stress. So reduce your stress, and especially reduce your wife's stress. That's even more important, that her stress be lower. And it's important that both of you are giving time and attention to the kids. It's especially important that you, as the father, are giving time and attention to the kids. So you need to convert time and attention from work or other pursuits into child-focused time and attention. That's the second most important thing you can do, and it happens. You will have better progress and success doing that if you're building upon a strong marriage, a strong ability to interoperate, cooperate with your wife. All right, next. Then you look at your child's day to day and you say, how can I transfer time they're spending in entertainment mode and in internet mode and in social media, most perniciously? How can I take whatever time they're spending on that kind of thing, that genre? I need to transfer that time into, they have more responsibilities. They have greater accountability. There's something that they are working toward, that for which they can be held accountable and evaluated, that helps them develop their sense of responsibility and competence. So we want less entertainment, less social media, less dopamine hitting, greater competence and responsibility. Then the next transfer to make is look at your child's day to day, and you say, okay, how can I transfer time that they're spending in institutional settings and structured, supervised settings like extracurriculars, run by the school or by the town? How can I transfer that time into unstructured, unsupervised time or loosely supervised time, right? Like there's a big difference between adults being around for like life safety, right? Keep your kid from falling in the river. You can like sit there and read a book without being the facilitator for whatever game the kid is playing on the playground or on the ball field. Just be like, that's on you. You're doing them a favor. You are helping them develop greater self-confidence, greater ability to navigate the world, greater ability to develop relationships with their peers. They are better off if you don't get involved, right? You just need to provide an environment for them to interact with other children, and not necessarily their exact age, but just like be in an environment where they can run free and interact with other people and the world without you hovering over them. Marriage, your time and attention, replace your children's entertainment with your children being responsible, and replace children's structured, supervised time with unstructured, unsupervised time. All right, the next big move, and this is maybe the most important one, but maybe the most difficult, although not as difficult as you probably think. But the next big move, if you want to improve outcomes for your child, is figure out a way to go from a single family home to an extended family home, or at least an extended family hometown, where as a regular part of life, your children on a daily or at least weekly basis are not only interacting with their mom and dad and maybe a sibling, but they are on a regular basis interacting with mom and dad and a sibling and an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or grandma or grandpa. And this is part of their regular life, is that they have long-term enduring bonds, a sense of belonging with people who take ownership of their development. They hold them accountable and they coach them, they mentor them, they teach them. Or at a peer level, these are people with whom they'll share bonds into adulthood. So anything you can do to be closer to and spend more time with, facilitate your child spending more time with their extended family, the better off your children will be. But not only that, it doesn't end there. It gets even better, because you'll also realize as soon as you do that, you've also benefited yourself directly. You will now have a stronger, more reliable, more enduring network of people providing you with support and mentorship and coaching and holding you accountable as a man and your wife. But we're not talking about her. We're talking about you, right? You'll have brothers-in-law. You'll have your own brothers. You'll have your father or your father-in-law, your uncles, grandparents, who knows? You'll have men with whom you can have a discussion and seek counsel and guidance, so that as you're navigating your OODA loop of adulthood and marriage and fatherhood, you're not doing it in isolation, but you are regularly doing it with multiple people with whom you have a long-term backstory and long-term forward-looking relationship. Now, again, we can talk about the difference between men and women and the degree to which they form bond. There's a whole bunch of data on that. I'm going to skip it for purposes of this video, but men in particular have better outcomes in their marriages and family lives if those men have, in real life, geographically located network of other men on whom they can rely. It is asymmetrical. It benefits men more. And the benefit that men receive from that benefits their wives and their marriage and their children. So there is a significant benefit to everybody, but it channels through the benefit that the husband receives. The other reason that this is better than you think it is because when this experiment began, the idea that got in people's heads, the baby boomer generation got in their heads most deeply, is this idea that, well, what everyone needs is financial independence. And the only way to get financial independence is to get the good job. The only way to get the good job is get the good degree. And so you have to spend a bunch of time in school and focused on your studies and extracurriculars so you can get into the college so that you can leave the house as soon as possible and go be independent. And then you can go to wherever the best paying job takes you. And that, the baby boomers thought, would solve all the problems of their childhood in the 1950s. For reasons that I don't want to unpack all of that, but that's the connection. Now, what that has done is ratcheted all of us into a rat race of earn the paycheck so you can afford the lifestyle. Because consider that if you were in some hometown environment rather than isolated in some suburbia, if you were around friends and family, you wouldn't have to pay, mom and dad and you wouldn't both be paying a mortgage. You'd have one house with an in-law suite, right? And your home price wouldn't be twice as much as yours is alone. And in all likelihood, since you've moved to someplace chasing the job with the big pay, you're over your head anyway in some high cost of living zip code. Whereas you can go back to wherever mom and dad are, and more likely than not, I mean, it's not always the case, but more likely than not, you can get more house for less money there, which means you'll have plenty of space for grandma and grandpa or your single, cousin who would love, by the way, to provide childcare, which means you're not having to pay for all those extracurriculars, which is, the biggest expenses that come out of a family's budget are their mortgage and childcare. And those are two things that they only have to pay for because they are both separated from their family and they're in a high cost of living zip code where everybody else who's in the rat race has consolidated and there's more demand than there is supply for housing. So this is an easy fix. Unwind all of that chain. You go back to somewhere that you can afford more house for less money. You don't have to pay for childcare. Your children have a better environment with more people who care about them long term. There's less need for them to be entertained or on social media or in daycare or extracurriculars. And here's the big unlock. Here's the one opportunity that we have starting today that, nobody can blame Gen Xers or baby boomers for not thinking of this. It wasn't available to them, but it is available to us. That as of right now, more than ever before in the last 175 years, you can work doing anything for anyone from anywhere. So the race to get to the big city with the big job, well, that's nonsense. You can work for that same corporation from Idaho. You can have 10 acres instead of a 1,000 square foot apartment where you raise chickens and your kids are responsible for taking care of whatever backyard livestock you want to have while you're working your high power corporate job from Idaho. And your quality of life will go up dramatically because your cost of living has gone way down. And you're not spending any time commuting, right? Because in addition to our 40 plus hours a week in the office, we're spending 10 plus hours a week driving to and from the office, which is time we're not spending on giving time and attention to our children. And it makes us unhappy. So all of this is either a virtuous or a vicious cycle. And you and I today have an opportunity, one, in the moment, right now in 2025, to start changing all these dynamics. Because although our parents could not have foreseen it, our aunts and uncles in the Gen X generation could not have availed themselves of it, we can. That we no longer have to be part of this rat race that was set up in 1950. And so our children don't have to suffer all the deleterious consequences of that rat race. Our marriages don't have to suffer. We don't all have to feel isolated and depressed as so many men, women, and children do today. I thought I had one more slide, but it's not advancing. So I guess I was wrong. So that is the roadmap. That is the roadmap for fathers who want to rebuild their families and marriages to be better off for them, their wives, their children, and for their extended families and communities. Now, like any engine, right? Like there's a flywheel spinning and it's hard to slow it and reverse it. That takes a lot of exertion of energy. And so I'm not trying to pretend that this is simple. But right now, the biggest thing holding you back as a man is where we started with, is isolation and a lack of a support network to provide you with coaching, teaching, mentorship to accelerate and improve the quality of your OODA loop. That is holding you back from your ability to make any of these changes or anything else you might want to do, is that you don't have the bandwidth to develop a strategy, to put it into practice, to like stay on track with that plan. And so the solution to that problem, the way to kickstart the engine, is to avail yourself of a network of like-minded men who are not only similarly situated in that they are also husbands and fathers, but are also similarly situated in that, forgive me, I'm having a technical problem, but are also similarly situated in that they are also committed to this vision, right? They see that things aren't working the way they are. We have a problem. We have a generational problem. We can identify what that problem is and how to fix it. And now what we just need is to develop strategies to apply these principles and broad strategic roadmap to our individual situations. Well, in order to do that, we all need mutual support and accountability, as well as support and mentorship. You can't, even if you get it, you see it, you want to, and you might not be fully convinced, like, there's still like some gaps for me. There's still like, that would make sense if you don't fully see the whole picture. The whole roadmap is not yet coherently like hanging together in your mind. That might make sense. However, to the extent that you're at least willing to entertain, like, yeah, this is starting to add up, I just can't see how I would do it. The thing holding you back, the linchpin to this whole operation, to following through on this roadmap and seizing this opportunity that you and I have in this moment in time, is the degree to which you are able to increase the speed and quality of your OODA loop iterations. And that is directly related to the extent to which you have a network of men to whom you can go for support, peer mentorship, guidance, lessons learned, and for accountability. Meaning, if you have a goal and you've set upon implementing some or all of these strategic approaches to improving your marriage and family life, we all know, you can, whether from lived experience or from literature on like performance and psychology and sociology, is we all know that we perform better, we follow through more, we achieve higher goals when we have accountability and mutual support, a peer group of people who drive us, support us, pull us along, lift us up when we fall. And that is why I created Fit for Fatherhood as a closed community. Because watching this video, I hope, is beneficial to you, but I hope you also recognize that knowledge is not enough. You need to figure out how to translate this knowledge into action. And today we weren't exhaustive. We didn't cover everything you would need to know to put this strategy into practice. We just explored the background and context and the understanding of how the situation came to be, what defines it, and what it would take to fix it at a high level. But in order to like really get into this in a meaningful way, you need to dedicate some time and attention. But that alone, unless like me, you're going to spend the next 4 years on this full time, what the fastest and best way to accelerate your OODA loop iterations is through community. And so I designed Fit for Fatherhood as a community to do just that. And if you go to mr-homemaker.com and you scroll down to the downloadable tools and application, if you click that link, you will get a Google Sheet copied to your Google Drive, no tracking or tracing, no email required to download it. And you put in a little data, it'll take you 5 minutes, and it will tell you what programs at Fit for Fatherhood you are eligible for. Now, in terms of timeliness, like this video will be around forever, but as of today, we're coming up on our next cohort. Will begin on March 22nd, which means you want to have your application in by 1 week prior, the 15th. So you have about 2 weeks. If you're watching this today, you have 2 weeks to get your application in to be part of the Mercury program. Be one of the plank holders of the Mercury program in 2025. And I'm not going to go through all of the details here. The punchline is, if you're still with me, use the code F4FYT6 as a tracking number in your application. And in addition to all the other benefits that are there on the application page that you'll see after you download the Google Sheet, is that there are 3 enlistment bonuses. And instead of picking one, you'll get all 3 if you use that code. And you need to have that in before March or by March 15th in order to be part of the next cohort. So I hope that this has been a fruitful video for you. I hope that it has been illuminating to understand why we are having the challenges that we are today as men, as husbands, as fathers, why our families are suffering in the way that they are, and what we can do to address it. How geography has led to undermining our flourishing, how this last 75 years of experimentation has derived data from which we can draw relevant and meaningful and unavoidable conclusions about what we should do as fathers and husbands in order to improve our lives for our entire families. And we talked about what those specific steps would be, a little bit of sequencing, a little bit of what is most important and what should come in what order. So I invite you to go to mrhomemaker.com, mr-homemaker.com, download your application, use the code F4FYT6 is the code to get. It's like $75 worth of gear that you'll receive for using that code in your application by March 14th. All right, so this is Marcus. Thanking you for your time and attention and looking forward to getting your application online. All right, thanks.